No. Okay, now we're on. We're live. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to our weekly performance and interview series. Today we have the wonderful pianist and composer and educator and drummer and organist that I've just learned, and vocalist Reuel Lubag. We were just talking a minute ago. Actually, we had another, I guess, kind of quasi-interview catching up because it's been a while since we've seen each other. But number one, Reuel, thank you for joining us. Thank you for being here.
I'm glad to be here. It's good to see you. It's been far too long.
Yes, it has. So we first met in the late 90s. If you're around the jazz scene in Tacoma at the late 90s, there was a club called Grounds for Coffee, which is now the Bostwick Cafe. But they had a nice piano in there. They had a cool jam session, and I believe that's where I first met Reuel playing, and he was tearing it up back then. But that's neither here nor there. We've known it. We're old. Let's just leave it at that. And been involved with the jazz scene around the Northwest for a long time. So anyways, Reuel, I want to talk about, I have a bit of a post at the beginning of this post about kind of like your backstory and your history. Oh, okay. And before I go any further, I always forget to mention this. If you have any questions for myself or Reuel, just put them in the comments. And towards the last 15 minutes of the interview, we'll get into them and answer as much as we can. So, can you talk about, you've had a huge career in music and still have a huge career in music. Can you talk about how you started playing? Did you grow up here in the Northwest, and how did all of this start to begin?
Well, the whole thing starts really with my home life. My dad was in the service. I was born in Hawaii, and we moved around a lot. My first piano teacher was actually my mom. So she played some piano, and then of course, my mom and dad, they sang in church and, grew up in church. So grew up playing, hymns and stuff like that. But I was interested in music, but I really got interested because I watched my sister, who was taking lessons, watch her play. And so I would, we both learned to read early. We have a younger sister too, but, it was just the two of us. But we both learned to read early, so I would just look at her lessons and look at her books and just kind of imitate her, and then, sort of start teaching myself. And my mom saw that, and so she plugged me in, with a few lessons there. But I didn't really start formal training until I was 7. That's when I had a full-blown teacher who was this great classical teacher when we lived in Petaluma, California. She got me started doing scales and handing and playing all classical literature. So that's kind of my start in terms of learning the instrument.
So 7 years old, and then so when did you start getting introduced to jazz, or was that much later?
Like most kids, you get into 6th grade, and they offer band. Oh, it's like, cool, maybe I can learn an instrument. So we went to the big thing at the gym, Lake Washington High School, and, I might want to play trumpet. I couldn't buzz my lips. Oh, I probably can't do trombone then either. And it's like, well, saxophone's kind of cool, clarinet. Oh, Raquel's playing the clarinet. It's like, well, the flute. It's like super small and easy to carry. I'll do the flute. So I did the flute, and but when I got into 7th grade, picked up clarinet and saxophone, and then I was still playing classical piano. Then I quit playing piano to focus on woodwinds, and got to my sophomore year of high school. I was singing for Jack Coons, his son Kelly. I'm sure grew for thought. Jack was the choir teacher. He had this great choir program that was like a football program. The way he developed these singers and musicians, and I wanted to make the vocal jazz group, and I wanted to be like his son Kevin, be a vocalist, play reeds. Well, all the piano players were graduating except my sister, but my sister reads. She doesn't do chords that much. And he found out. I had kept it hidden I played piano. And he found out, and he goes, hey, your chances of making the choir would improve if you maybe could play piano. And he says, tell you what, I'll give you lessons. And, then you'll have that. And ironically, he charged me $5 a lesson anyway, even though it was kind of in his bed. Well, took the first lesson, blues. Here's a basic voice. Dude, this is the stuff I'm hearing on the Abersold records I'm playing with. That's what Dan Hurley's playing on. I was hooked. So I took 4, maybe 5 lessons from him. And that was my start. And just started listening. I mean, I was listening already because I was trying to, listen to Charlie Parker and Coltrane, Woody Shaw, was like later on. But yeah, that's when I got introduced.
So when did you start hearing jazz? So you're talking about the vocal jazz program. So if you're playing saxophone, how did you start getting introduced to some of these musicians? If
Seventh grade.
Seventh
That was
grade.
back in seventh grade because we called it stage band, right? It wasn't jazz band. Couldn't say jazz band. Public school.
Yeah, we had stage band too. I mean, here in Tacoma, we had stage band. I'm a alumni of Mason Middle School, but stage band then. I mean, we were playing like Motown stuff. Like this was 5th, 6th grade. I was maybe 11 years old, and it was like the boy from New York City, and
Right. Well, there were those things. I mean, we played "Make Me Smile" by Chicago. We had a great band program at Kirkland Junior High. In fact, the guy who was my beginning band teacher and my junior high teacher, Chet Patuzik, he had actually been to Lake Washington, but it was just too much work to run marching band. So he decided to go take a step down and go back to Kirkland Junior High. Built one of the best junior high band programs. I mean, we won the sight reading trophy at Abbotsford. I mean, we outread the high school and college groups.
Yeah, I guess what I'm saying is like a lot of middle school programs, not in Seattle. It's a different animal in Seattle, but it's very rare for them to be introduced to Woody Shaw or Charlie Parker or John Coltrane at that age. Maybe this is that person, and it ends there. They don't actually like check out that music.
Yeah. Well, he just had us playing some regular stage band stuff. I mean, there were charts that were typical for most of the schools at the time. We were playing. I remember the first piece we got handed was, I can't remember who the composer was, called Totem Pole, and then we played that, and then we had Make Me Smile that might have been 8th grade. But a friend of mine who's actually a couple weeks younger than me, he's a year behind me in school. This guy's brilliant mathematician. We ended up going to college together, roommates together, and he's now a cancer researcher at Fred Hutch. That's what he's been doing. But he was musically way ahead of us. So in 8th grade, he and I met. I was in 8th, he was in 7th. He was already listening to a former Art Blakey guy named Chuck Mangione, and Chuck, basically, he sounded like Dizzy Gillespie without the chops of Dizzy, but you could tell he was coming out of that. And I started listening to, everyone thinks of Feel So Good and all that, but I started listening to Bella Via and all those albums, and hearing his compositional work, Children of Sanchez, what's the Land of Make Believe. Well, 9th grade, we played like stuff from the Land of Make Believe in this stage band. We had the musicianship to be able to pull that stuff off. And by that time, Jim had started listening. Hey, man, you got to check out, have you've been checking out, Louis Armstrong and the bass man. He says, you need to check out this guy, Charlie Parker. First time I listened, couldn't listen to it. It was the same reaction. It's like, oh, man, it's busy, man. I don't understand it. I kept listening to it. And then the next thing he goes, hey, man, I've been checking out this guy, John Coltrane. So here's my friend who's, like I said, he's a year behind me in school, but he's only 2 weeks younger than me. But he was so far ahead of the rest of us musically. And he's really was the guy who got me listening to these guys. And then from there, I started buying records. Got my first job at Wendy's. I'd go to Rubato Records in Bellevue, flip through, and anyone that I recognized. The first thing I did was the public library, I got this Prestige 2 for Giant. It's like, oh, Miles Davis. I know who that is. Oh, John Coltrane's on here. Oh, Horace Silver. I don't know who that is. Okay, I'll check him out. And just started recording albums onto cassette, just where.
And so at this time you're playing clarinet and saxophone. So when you started doing the jazz choir, that's where piano kind of took over.
Yeah, my junior year of high school.
Did you ever make a conscious shift to like only doing piano? Was that the moment where you just kind of switched over to just piano? Or
no, I was still playing saxophone in concert band / wind ensemble, and actually I didn't quit that until my second year of college. And part of it is I needed to do those ensembles for my degree. But I actually almost made the second band on second alto my sophomore year at college because my sound wasn't very good, but I could read better than the sax player.
Well, so now, and forgive me, you might have mentioned this. Which high school did you attend?
Lake Washington High School.
Lake Washington. Okay, cool.
Yeah, Jack Coons was there. Yeah.
Okay. All right. And so then from Lake Washington, I'm assuming at this point, I'm interested in also just the scene at that time. So did you start playing in any clubs or gigs or going out and seeing any local musicians around at that time?
Oh, yeah. we go to jazz festivals. I'd see folks there. Bellevue Jazz Festival was great, open air festival.
Was that Hal Sherman or before Hal's time there?
Oh no, this is like years ago. It was like I'm not sure like who was really there, but they had it was the Bellevue Jazz Festival, and I think it was run by the city. I'm not exactly sure who ran it, but I remember going to that. And of course, like I said, you go to jazz festivals with your band, and you see these great college bands show up at like the Kent Meridian Jazz Festival. Hal Sherman and the Kent Meridian Jazz Festival introduced a whole generation of young musicians to these programs at the universities like Western and Central and Mount Hood. And so you knew that these are places where, listen to those bands. And I was very fortunate because of just the situation at Lake Washington. There was a connection to Central because of Jack's kids who were going there. And I got to hear that band. And I was enthralled. I first heard them on tape. My student teacher, Don Wolf, who I ended up working with, he was a worship pastor later. We ended up working together for 10 years. But he was a student teacher, and he had a recording of this band from Central. And it was as good as any pro band I'd ever heard. And in that band, Gary Hobbs was actually a student in that band, and Greg Metcalf. They were later go on with Kenton. Max, can't think of his great guitar player from Portland. But it blew me away. And that was like one of my goals is like, hey, if I go to college, I want to go to school at Central because that band. And they could play.
Yeah, definitely. Well, I want to get into Central because I know there's a lot of. I've done several of these interviews now, and you come up in a lot of them. But I want to talk about, I guess, like the club scene around that area, Seattle, at that time, and your memories. Were there any sessions or local musicians that you would go check out or hang out with?
It was a different thing. I started playing with my friend Jim. We started. First of all, we started goofing off because we heard like John Coltrane, and we kind of did it as a parody. We got some guys and we'd play instruments and make up melodies and improvise. And we were just kind of mocking it. But what we weren't realizing is that we were actually improvising based on what we were listening to. And then my senior year, we formed an actual group. And actually the end of my junior year. And we actually got hired by the city of Kirkland to play on a stage at the, what would they call it? Kirkland Moss Bay Days. And I didn't have a bass player, so I hired Kelly Coons, Jack's son, who was at Central, to play bass with us. So that was my first gig. I remember getting $50, which now, in those dollars, would be like, what? $120 now.
Those gigs probably still pay the same too.
Yeah. But senior year, we did it again. I was working at Wendy's, and there was a drummer who was from Inglemoor, and he was a good drummer. And he played with us. It was Alina Cummings, Roy Cummings, who taught at UW, his daughter. She was in Jim's class. Jim on trumpet, and a guy named Brian Kennedy on bass, great bass player. He doesn't play jazz anymore, but he was John Hanson's roommate for a long time. He was my first student. Okay. And we had a quintet, and we played Moss Bay Days. We played like 3 or 4. So that was kind of when I started gigging, was doing those Moss Bay Day things. And then I remember playing with Green River Music Company. Pat Thompson called Jack Coon and says, hey, we've got this show for the Washington Cattlemen's Association, and our piano player can't make it. How's that piano player? Well, how's his reading? He says, I think he can do it. So I went and did a pro bono on Halloween night, went in 4 o'clock in the afternoon, read through the show, and Pat goes, I think we're good to go. Played the show at 6:30 to 7:30, and nailed the show. And then, I was, 16, 17 years old, something like that, 17 maybe.
So no, like there used to be. In fact, when I was growing up in high school, there was a session that I used to attend at Tula's every Sunday, which was you and Andre Thomas and Michael Bezio, which was a bit of an intimidating rhythm section for me as a young player to come in. this was, again, the internet was just starting. There were no iReal Pro, any of that kind of
No.
stuff. So the thing that I learned from that session was, you'd go up and they'd say, all right, we're going to play this tune, 1, 2, whether you knew it or not. And you either kind of got your way through it or heard it or didn't. In fact, I remember one time, it was one of the first times like I had learned Just Friends, and I learned it in the key of C. And then the band, I was like, okay, I know the song. Then the band played it, which I didn't know, in the key of F. It's like, oh, I need to learn this. So there were some well-learned lessons from those sessions, unlike now where things are a lot more, I guess, friendlier. Not that it was unfriendly, but it was more like an old-school jam session.
Oh, yeah.
But I guess what I'm getting at is, were there any sessions like that where you could go play as a young student, young musician, to kind of hone your skills in Seattle?
I'm really glad you asked that. No. So here's what it did. Like my senior year, you meet other musicians at festivals, you start connecting. I started, and especially the summer after my senior year, they used to do what was called the Bellevue Jazz Festival All-Star High School Jazz Band. And I auditioned for it. Roy Cummings ran it. I met a whole bunch of great musicians from other schools. So I'm on this band. The guitar player is Mark Whitfield, who's a pretty serious player. It ended up, the bass player from my high school, very talented guy. He ended up on it. So, just was a great player. Janet McNaughton was the drummer from Interlake High School. But the band was full of, like, Pat Loomis, Chris Holmquist, who was from Interlake. I don't know if she plays professionally. But there was a whole bunch of just great players. Rob Birdwell, who's a jazz trumpet guy. And, Clarence Aycock to this day, he says, yeah, that was the best band they ever had, because we had just everyone could solo almost, and then the band just could play. And so the guys who didn't make the band were guys like Steve McKinney from Tyee, Aaron Alexander from Roosevelt, John Silverman from Roosevelt. Let's see. There were a couple other guys. Well, guess what? I connected with them, and we'd do jam sessions at their house. Sometimes we do gigs. And that's really the start of it. It's like getting together. Okay, there wasn't really anything for us to do because everything was 21 or older. There just wasn't the opportunity. So guess what? We reached out, got in our cars and drove. I'd drive down to Tyee High School in Burien, right, where we'd meet somewhere in the middle. I'd drive over to, Roosevelt, where those guys all lived in that area. So we did what we needed to. Drive to Bellevue, play at Mark Whitfield's house or Rob Birdwell's house down in Sammamish. And that's how we did it. It's how we connected, because we didn't have what people have now. Yeah. But let me tell you, it was fun, because you had guys who you had no history with, but here you are getting together, trying to learn this common vocabulary, and you realize, oh, we're all kind of trying to figure out and do the same thing. Yeah. It's what you do now as a professional. When someone comes into town and they hire you to play, hey, I need a tenor player. Here, I'll send you the charts and recordings, and we'll play the show, right? Yeah.
Wonderful. All right. Well, let's get into Central, because I know that there's tons of Pacific Northwest musician connections at Central. Yeah. So you kind of already touched on this already about how and why you ended up going to Central. You had a bunch of friends that were going there. Can you talk about your time there and lessons learned and all that kind of good stuff?
Well, the main driving force behind it was a guy who created this amazing legacy with all the guys who came through there and gals who came through there as teachers and musicians, a guy named John Mowat. And anyone who knows the history of John, he was actually one of the top call drummers in Seattle, but over the years he developed really bad bursitis, and it just got too painful for him to play. But he had great programs at Seattle Central College at the time. He had a great program. His last great program was at Nathan Hale, and that program is legendary. There's recordings of that. Norm Wallen was a kid in that band, and there was a great trombone player who runs LA Jazz Workshop. I don't know if he still does. He might have retired. A guy named Bill Yeager. He was in that band. I mean, that band had just nobody had heard or seen a band at the high school level that sounded like a pro band like that. Well, he ended up at Central and built this amazing program over the legacy that Bert Christensen had started, and then Bob Panero had carried, and then John took it to another level. The band that I heard on reel-to-reel tape, That was the band of the year for big bands in 1973 with Gary Hobbs in there. And, you know, and then he would just turn out these great players out in the middle of nowhere. But it was kind of like, you know, Vern Seelert, who's at the University of Idaho. When he moved here, he found out that it was kind of like the way, you know, University of North Texas State, that was the reputation in that part of the country. It's out in the middle of nowhere, so all guys can do is sit around, hang out, listen to records, learn to play. Yeah. And that's that made the scene happen, you know. And I met a bunch of those guys at the Cool Jazz Picnic the summer before I went to Ellensburg. We all ended up in the same spot at the Cool Jazz Picnic in front of the main stage. And it's like, hey, you know, I know you from somewhere. And yeah, hey, I heard you're coming to school at Central. You know, Mike West goes, hey, maybe you'll play my quartet if you want. You know, I've known him now for 40 years.
Well, can you talk about some of the folks
who went through that program?
Who went through that program at the same time, like your sphere of influence?
Unfortunately, a couple of them. First rhythm section I was in, Eric Brengelman, Eric Stewart, he passed away from cancer. And then just recently, my friend Gary Williams unexpectedly passed away. But, you know, they're the first two guys in the first rhythm section. I made the first band my freshman year. A lot of it was circumstances. I mean, I could play, but the circumstances gave me that opening, and I was more than willing to jump in. Mike West was there, a guy named Bruce Babbitt, fantastic player. Gosh, I mean, it's like a who's who. Jim Sisko. John Weekon. Well, yeah, John kind of, I took him on as a protege. You wouldn't have believed the way he sounded his freshman year. Jake Bergevin. Let's see. Greg Lyons. Yes. Yeah. I mean, you could go through lists and lists of people. I mean, it's like Mike West. I mean, there's guys who actually don't even play anymore, but like Mike Mines. I think about Mike Mines. Dennis Haldane, although Dennis is 10 years ahead of us. Greg Metcalf. Pete Wilson. You know, a lot of these guys are great teachers who are now retired. Alan Paxton. You know, Bob Pinerio Jr., great trumpet player, played a lot of the shows at the Fifth Avenue and stuff like that. I mean, I could just go through list after list of how many musicians went there.
I think I remember hearing a story. Like, didn't you have a rhythm section that started playing with Jay Thomas at this time? Or was that?
Oh yeah, that was actually John Weekon, and then bass was just depending on who we had. Usually, it was actually Brian Kennedy, who I said was the guy who had played with me when I was in high school. Although he was only a 7th grader at Kirkland Junior High, and he was playing with us in the combo. I taught him how to read changes and how to build a bass line, and he took it from there. And he ended up becoming one of the first call bass players in town, like, by the time he was in college. I mean, he was such a good reader.
What time frame is this? This is 80s, in the 1980s?
So I got to Central in 82, and then John, he came to Central in 88, maybe 87, and then in 89, we were playing with Jay quite a bit. We'd go to his house and do sessions. And then at the end of 89, we did an album together that Jay is on. It was a great learning experience, you know. And but let's see, we were doing sessions at Jay's house. That's when I first met Jeff Johnson. I think it was 89, you know. And then when I looked up Jeff, I go, oh, man, this cat played with, like, Philly Joe. You know. Yeah.
All right. And so did you attend Central? Was this like a music ed degree or just a performance degree? What were the intentions for college?
Yeah, I got, you know, into music ed, and then I got a call in 87 through a friend of mine, David Buer. I was at Jazz Port Townsend. I happened to go to my folks' house. They were out of the country, and just was going to stay there the night. Turned on the answering machine, and partway through was a message from, and I go, beep. He goes, yeah, my name's Mike Duva. I'm the road manager for the Glenn Miller Orchestra, and we got your name as a reference and would like to know if you'd like to come play piano on the band. And so my buddy Dave Buer, who I'd met at Jazzport Towns in 85, so this is like 2 years later, he'd referred me. And he had actually Greg Williamson had actually been on the band. I knew Greg was on the band, but Dave referred me. Greg had actually was no longer on the band, but Dave referred me for the piano chair. And that was my first call to go out with, one of those name bands. And it kind of launched a series of other tours with other things.
So let's dive into that, because we were talking before the interview here just about how the music business and the music scene, particularly for jazz, has changed because there's not as many touring bands and there's not as many gigs. So at that time, pre-Spotify, pre all of this stuff, at pre-internet, there were more opportunities. There were more clubs. Can you maybe talk about life on the road with the Glenn Miller Band and what that looked like at the time that you were participating in that?
It wasn't as glamorous as it's, as you'd think. Everyone looks at the stage and you see these guys in either the red or the blue jacket, whichever tie they say we're wearing this tie tonight. And it was generally a different hotel every night, generally. Sometimes we'd be lucky and have a couple days, 3 days in one place, but generally different hotel every night. If you could afford it, because you had to pay your own room, you had to pay your own food. It was a flat rate. I think they started you at $400 a week, and you paid your own expenses. So, but when I got on the band, check this out. It was like playing in the North Texas 2 o'clock band. Most of the guys were from North Texas. I think a couple of guys had actually made the top band a couple times, but it was mostly North Texas guys. And then the rest of the guys, there were a couple guys from Cincinnati Conservatory. Amazingly, the rhythm section, 2/3 of it, was myself and Dave Buer, and we're both from the Pacific Northwest. Look at that. And they just missed by about a month. It would have been Greg Williamson and Dave and I playing on there. We'd all met at Jazzport Towns together. And Dave was a protege at that time of John Clayton and Ray Brown. So, and then Greg was, of course, studying with Jeff Hamilton. So we just missed that opportunity for 3 of us to play together on the band together. It would have been cool. But, yeah, it was like playing North. So these guys could play. They could all solo. And we do sessions, man, and I was not prepared. I mean, I'll be the first to tell you. I could comp. I had a lot of my vocabulary together. I still use today. Of course, it's much more advanced now. But, a solid vocabulary. But when it came time to solo, it was okay. But there was 2 guys who really inspired me. One was a third trumpet player named Kurt Weiss. Another was Joe Farnsworth. Oh, Joe Farnsworth had actually been on the band, and he was no longer on the band. But John Farnsworth, his brother, was a trombone player on the band. And both these guys could play bebop, piano, solos, like crazy. And they were into Sonny Clark, heavy into Sonny Clark. Sonny Clark's great. And we do these sessions, and I started realizing, what am I doing out here? We do these sessions, and yeah, it's fun, and I can comp, but I can't really. So it's like I need to get off the road, and I got to figure out how to play. But these guys inspire me, and I thank them. I send them notes sometimes. They say, "Hey, man, thanks for inspiring me." And I could have stayed on the band, and in some ways I should have. But I realized that I needed to get to another level. So I got off the band, went back to school. Guess what? Another call comes to go do a tour. So I ended up doing 3 other tours. I got Wecon on one of them. But let me tell you, what they did is putting me in a professional situation. I was one of the youngest guys, second youngest guy in the band, in the Miller Band. And then later on, it was sort of the same. It taught me no matter what you're at physically, you need to be ready on the bandstand, ready to go. You got to have your eggs in a basket. It's about business. And dealing with the rigors of the roads. Some guys, they'd settled in and they had their routine, but a lot of guys would sleep on the bus all day long. I put headphones on. I learned this on that first tour with the Glenn Miller Band. I listened. 8-10-hour bus rides every day. Guess what? I had headphones on. First cassettes, later on CDs, and I would just listen. And that's how I learned. 90% of what I learned as a musician is from listening, 10% from practice. And that afforded me the chance. That was my education in jazz. That was it. And then when we get to different cities, I go and sit in on jam sessions. I met Mike Smith, who was at the time Frank Jr.'s, I think, musical director, lead alto player. I met on that same, I just sat in, I asked to sit in, at the Green Mill. And it was Paul Wertico was the drummer. And, we hit it off. I actually hired Paul later for one of my best friend's wedding gigs. If you can imagine, oh, here's Paul Wertico, Pat Metheny's drummer, on a wedding gig, playing Shiny Stockings, But that was, wherever I'd go, I'd meet people. I met Kenny Drew Jr., at a club when I was touring.
I have several questions. I want to jump in. There's more questions as you're doing this. One, I want to ask about how long were you on the Miller Band before you decided to bow out and
Well, aside from the musical thing, I knew after about 6 weeks, I was like, this band's okay. I mean, you hear things when you're in the band. You can't hear them in the audience. What most people don't understand is when you're playing an ensemble, the stuff that you know is wrong, you can hear it. When you're a listener, you might not necessarily hear it unless you're really paying attention. So the band actually was sometimes sloppy, sometimes played out of tune. And the band leader, he was a nice guy, but he wasn't really what I expected as a band leader. Well, I decided, and combined with the playing thing, I decided I would give my notice. Well, he retired early. They brought on Larry O'Brien, who had led the band before. And Larry's a great trombone player. He had been working as musical director for Frank Sinatra Jr. Immediately, Larry and I clicked. And at the time, I was much thinner. I'd go running on the band breaks. We had band breaks every 2 hours, and at lunch. And Larry was an avid runner. We'd pass each other. Well, I also found out he loved, why am I spacing on his name? The great writer wrote Close Enough for Love, wrote Theme for MASH, Johnny Mandel. He loved Johnny Mandel. And I had started listening to Johnny Mandel because of Monty Alexander. He says, I listen to Johnny Mandel soundtracks all the time. That's where I get my vocabulary. So he would loan me these soundtracks, and I went to Mike Duva. I said, hey, I'd like to stay on the band. And Mike goes, we got a replacement for you already. But he can't make it till February. Can you stay on another month? I said, okay, because I loved Larry. And immediately he goes, we're going to rehearse. This band is not good. He says, and you guys look terrible. He says, you got to remember, as a professional, people watch with their eyes, non-musicians. And, if anyone comes on, their uniform's not right, all of a sudden, music business. One thing Monty Alexander told me, he says, or Ray Brown told me, was that a lot of times guys forget the second word in the term music business, And so that struck me when Larry says, we got to take care of business on the bandstand. And he wasn't just talking about the music. Yeah.
Very good points in my T-shirt. Yeah. All right. Well, this is totally sidebar, but I just had a conversation with some other great musicians about this, and you just mentioned this, so I'm curious. Kenny Drew Jr. Let's sidebar and discuss Kenny Drew Jr. for a minute. So, what was he like as a person and as a musician? The son of the great Kenny Drew, the great pianist.
Well, he was obviously super talented. It was interesting because we're in this small bar in Tampa, and he's playing great. And I went up to say hello, introduce him, and he kind of blew me off. And, it's like, okay, well, Ray Brown had given me some advice a couple of years earlier. He said, hey, if you hear a musician you really like what they're playing, go up and introduce yourself, and see if you can converse with them. And he said, if they take the time with you, that's someone you want to, connect with. He says, if they blow you off, he says, they might be a great player, but in the end, you might want to make some other choices. So,
I heard he was a bit of a tortured soul. There was some stuff going on in his life. I don't know.
And from what I understood later, there was this whole expectation level. When you're the son of one of the legends, and I'm sure that when he comes to town that Ravi Coltrane could probably attest to that. He's best friends with Jerry Gibbs. They grew up together. And talking with Jerry, there was all this pressure on Ravi from all these different people. Elvin would pressure, and trying to find his own voice and be who he is. And I mean, how, that whole thing of how do you live up to that? It's like, well, that shouldn't be an expectation. Everybody has their own path. And, that was, from what I understood, that's kind of what had happened to Kenny Drew Jr. at that time.
Being a pianist in the Pacific Northwest, I always love asking this question too because I never got a chance to meet this person. But Jerome Gray, did you ever get a chance to interact with the great legendary Yoda of the piano, Jerome Gray?
Yeah. So there was a guy named Fred Wardenberg who I met at my first jazz camp in George Cable's class. And Fred, for whatever reason, took a liking to me. And back then, they used to give one scholarship out per instrument. This is in 85. So in 84, a year before, the piano scholarship winner had been a female pianist from Canada, from some small town up there. Her name was Diana Krall. So, so the next year, I actually won the next 2 years. I won that piano scholarship. Now, I'm not, that's neither here nor there, but it was mostly because I think I had my voicings. I think I told you. I had figured out voicings and how to play. I couldn't solo worth a darn. I actually couldn't hear worth a darn. Like my ear was not developed. And I've got a great story for you if you want to hear it. But, the whole thing was Fred was in the class. So I'm there as a scholarship student. I'm sleeping in my station wagon because I couldn't afford the dorm. So I'm sleeping. And the guys felt sorry for me halfway through because it was cold. Go, hey, man, there's empty. Just go in there. We're not going to tell on you. I was freezing out there. I had all my tapes. I had like stacks of tapes in my tape machine, and they'd see me in there listening at night, to tapes. And, but Ray took me under his wing because, he could hear like potential. And anyways, Fred, he goes, yeah, I think you'd like my teacher, Jerry Gray. He goes by Jerome. Well, a couple years later, we're talking at another camp. He goes, you know what, I'm going to pay for a couple lessons for you with Jerome. I think, you should meet him. And so it was just a gift, because he's not cheap. So I finally set up a lesson with Jerome. I go over to his house, and he goes, yeah, I kind of know how he plays this, but I want to talk to you about time. That's the only thing I want to talk about. In that one lesson, we talked about time. We talked about centering the beat, where to feel the beat. We talked about, okay, if you're going to tap your foot, how do you tap your foot? Because he wanted to really get me to understand about time and articulation. I never went back to take the second lesson. I actually ended up giving that back to Fred. But that one lesson, combined with spending a couple hours with Monty Alexander, it changed the course of my career and my learning path. Because it is about time. And I try to teach this in clinics. When we play a note, it's not just about the attack, it's about the release too. Because if you release the note late, the next entrance is going to be late, or early if you release it early. That's what playing in time is. That's what creates that pulse and that feel. And if you can dictate that on your instrument, it pulls everybody else in together. And that's one of the big things I learned from that, is that, even if I'm in a situation where maybe someone's less experienced, I can help them out by how I place things and how I play them and lift the level of the music. At that point, you have to sacrifice any agenda you have. It's not about you. It's not about what you can do. It's about the music. That's what's important.
Yeah, that's the tricky thing. I've working with ensembles and students trying to explain. It's not about playing all the notes, but just what notes you play, making it feel good. And sometimes you have to do what's going to make the group sound good, as opposed to just younger students that they're worried about being in the right place, not playing wrong notes, just getting through. But it's like, just make it feel good. If you do that, then that helps out a ton. I just did a couple clinics with Lincoln High School recently, and we spent a bunch of time on time. Part of what I present, and I did this when I did Native Jazz Quartet. We did a tour to South America. We did this whole thing, the Mike Longo, Dizzy Gillespie universal time concept. Everything's built off the 12/8, and building that consistency and rhythm, whatever the tempo is, so that you can learn to feel where the pulse is, where the time is, and know how to play within that.
It's that awareness that changes everything about the way you, because, and I told them, we were reading something, I said, don't worry about bad notes. Just play. If you don't know the note, just play a note in time, and then we'll fix it later. You can always fix the note. You can't fix the rhythm. That's what I always tell them. Yeah.
Sage advice. All right, well, let's go back. Not shoot, but we're at that time where we're opening things up for questions. Are there any questions? Okay, I'm going to keep barraging with questions. And if you have questions for myself or Reuel, please put them in the comments, and we'll do our best to accommodate them. So let's go back to, so you're after Glenn Miller, you're on hiatus from that, practicing, getting bebop vocabulary together, and then you got 3 other offers to do some other touring. So where did you go, and what did you do at that time?
So next one was the Herb Jeffries Orchestra with the Mills Brothers. And this was a great opportunity. I got John Weekon on this. There was a great tenor player in town for a minute named David Aguiar. Guy had perfect pitch. He was a Stanford Law School dropout because he was bored. His dad was one of the top corporate lawyers on Wall Street. This guy, I met him at Jasper Townsend. We played the main stage, and this amazing, like blistering solos. He could hear something once play back in all 12 keys, but he's out there barefoot in a Eschete. It was hilarious, but he just killed it. But I got him on the band, so we did the 6-week tour, and my focus was I wanted to do 2 things for that 6-week tour. I wanted to be able to play rhythm changes effectively, and I wanted to play giant steps. So I'd go early with the setup crew, and I'd practice all my arpeggios and like the Coltrane digital patterns, 1, 2, 3, 5, 5, 6, 7, 8, 1, 3, 5, 3, whatever, and just do 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 do. And guess what started happening, Kareem? Oh, the vocabulary that I've been trying to learn, just by doing this outlining, I'm starting to hear it in my head, and I started realizing, oh, gosh, if I even just start with this, eventually, and guess what? It eventually led to understanding more about the bebop thing. And then I went back to my, years ago I bought the Charlie Parker Omnibook. Well, I got it in C and started playing through all those solos. And that combined with playing those patterns on Giants, it's like, oh, I should have been doing this for years, right? And it totally changed everything. And then combine that with the comping, and I started realizing, oh, I can do this. And then, you pick up more vocabulary as you go along. But that was the big change. Being disciplined to go. The next big thing was Phil Woods came back, like my second jazz camp. Hal Galper got called away, and they didn't have a piano player for the master class. Bud Shank goes, Reuel, get up there. So I got to play with Phil Woods' quintet.
Was that with Tom Harrell at the time? Oh, man, that must have been awesome.
It was awesome. And Hal became a lifelong friend, as did Phil. And a few years later, Phil was back, and he presented another crux, which I think is an important tool, the guide tones exercise. And I'd forgotten they had introduced this before, but they went into real heavy detail about practicing this. And I started practicing it. Guess what? My hearing changed to another level, all this other stuff. To this day, I teach that as part of my students' thing. It's like, if you can play the guide tones exercise, it's basically the A section of autumn leaves. It's 2-5-1 in a major key, then 2-5-1 in the relative minor. Right. History of Western music in 8 bars, just learning all 12 keys. And you can play anything. And even if you're a non-pianist, you can use those, you play them all as voicings, and you can comp behind anybody too. So, but that changed, that was another track.
For people that don't know, that lesson that you just dropped is like an $80 lesson in like 2 sentences.
Oh, shoot.
It's
Send your checks to.
So really good advice. Really good advice. Okay, cool. Well, so you mentioned that there were 2 other tours that you said.
Yep, and then I did. So Glenn Miller. Oh, I'm sorry. The first one was the Jimmy Dorsey band. I forgot about that one. That was 3 months. That was with Henry Cuesta, who had been the tenor and clarinet soloist on the Lawrence Welk Show. Beautiful guy. And Terry Gibbs, who I'm still friends with, a great vibra-harpist. And we had Fran Jeffries, who was she sang Mambo Italiano in the Pink Panther, And who else was on that show? Terry and Fran. I can't remember who else was on that show. Oh, a group called String of Pearls. It was a 3-week tour or 3-month tour. Much of the same thing, travel day, and then, every different concert every night. But I got to play some of the same venues I did on the Miller Band. So you're playing in these beautiful, but it's that whole thing of take care of business, show up, do your thing. Then the tour with Jeffries, Mills Brothers, and the last one was with Buddy Greco and pianist Hucko. And now Buddy Greco is a great piano player. He was one of the youngest guys to play with Benny Goodman, but he could play bebop. In fact, one time he rattled off this bud. I go, man, why don't you do that and play like that? He goes, and he has a lazy eye, so he goes, doesn't pay the bills, man. And that's why he did his whole shtick, sort of half talk, half singing, like White Nat Cole kind of thing, But man, Buddy could seriously play. And Peanuts Hucko, great clarinet player. He was on the Miller Band he was in the War Band, with Glenn Miller.
So then after these experiences on the road, these tours, you decided just to settle in Seattle and teach and play, or what
came
was...
back. I met my eventual wife when I went back to school, and we started having kids, and started doing my music career. Got hired with my former sophomore year of high school, my former TA, who had played the tape of Central Band for me, got hired to work in a church worship ministry with him. It was one of the best things that ever happened to me because we didn't have a bass player, so guess what? I learned to kick bass, left-hand bass, and then comp. And then over the years, eventually I was temporary worship director. I would actually sing, sometimes harmony, most of the time harmony, and, run the rhythm section. I learned all these other valuable skills, managing people, arranging, because we needed it done, setting up sound systems, because we were a portable church. We had set up every week. So all this stuff that I'd learned on the road, packing stuff, getting set up, guess what? Paid off in terms of that. So worked in church worship ministry for 12 years there. I still do. I played at Danny Kolke's church this morning, played drums this morning. But I developed all these skills that became part of, eventually I had a 6-year, 7-year teaching gig at Seattle Pacific, running a vocal jazz group there, teaching jazz lessons. For a couple of years, I worked at EMP, did a summer camp, was the musical director for the youth choir, did arranging for that. I was actually doing that at the same time as at SPU and at the church worship ministry. I was writing music for all three of them, helping rehearse, doing the concerts. I mean...
Well, we talked about this briefly. Actually, we did like a whole separate interview. We were just catching up before the interview started. It's like, man, we need to discuss it in the interview, and I don't know if we'll have time. But you mentioned while you were in college at Central, there were venues, basically multiple venues that had live music 6 nights a week. And so you could play and get experience playing versus now, as we all know, I mean, COVID not helping, but even prior to COVID, it's not the same in terms of like opportunities and places to play where you can sustain like a full-time job just performing as a musician. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah. So, and this is just Ellensburg. When I got there in fall of '82, there were 10 venues in town, bars, restaurants, in hotels. They all had a band, live band, 6 nights a week. Guys are working 6 nights a week. Some from the music department, some are just locals. But a lot of the guys I was in school with and gals were gigging full time, making money and going to school. And by the time '85 rolled around, the CD had come in, and we were down to like 3 venues in town that had live music on the weekends only. It really changed. And that was just bar music, rock and roll, pop, and stuff like that. Hotels, there used to be this whole circuit. You would have a band, you could have a cover band. Yeah, it's playing, pop music cover, but you could gig full time, like for Hyatt. You'd play in a place for 1 or 2 weeks on a contract, get paid money. You'd stay in a hotel room. You could run a tab if you want, to cover your expenses. Sometimes you got food, but you could make a decent living going up and down the West Coast or going across the country, playing from Hyatt to Hyatt, or whatever chain. Best Westerns. Best Western had bar bands throughout the country. You could work full time in a working band. Yeah, it might not be music you might want to be playing, but you're playing. I mean, all those musicians were super skilled, you know, in those bands. I mean, because you listen to the record, you cop it. I did a top 40 band. I did a top 40 band for summer.
You were young and needed the money. Yeah.
No, I did it as a favor to some friends of mine who had sung for John Mowat. They decided they wanted to do a pop band. They didn't have a keyboard player. They said, hey, you know, would you be interested in doing this for summer? So I got the tapes, transcribed all this stuff. Sound familiar? I actually wrote charts out, and we did this. We started like at a couple bars, and then we did like a weekend out in Westport, and I tried to make it as much as possible because, you know, there's multiple keyboard things. As much as possible, try to match the record, right? Well, in 1 month, we went from playing these little bar gigs to we were in the Battle of the Bands at Pier 70, the top room, because we'd done the Battle of the Bands at SeaTac Lounge. We won. We ended up at Pier 70 within a month. That's how good the band was. That's how good the singers were, the other musicians. Mike Peterson was his drummer, crazy Mike Peterson, who was, you know, from Cornish. He was 18 at the time. Perfect time. He studied with Gary Williams. There's another central connection. But guess what? We had that successful gig. Well, a couple weeks later, I get a call. Hey, we got a contract to go and do the USO tour of Asia with the band. Are you in? It's like, I'm going back to school. So, you know, I had to, but let me tell you, I won't trade that experience to this day because it forced me to transcribe. I realized, you know, and that pop music from the 80s especially, there was way more music going on in that stuff than I was. I had been kind of a snob, jazz snob.
I think a lot of the pop music in the 80s can be attributed to Quincy Jones, too. I mean, that's, you know.
Well, there was some complicated stuff. Like, next time you get a chance, listen to Wang Chung, Everybody Have Fun Tonight, and check out that bridge. Oh, that bridge is cool, man.
Right on, right on. Well, any questions? No questions so far. Okay, cool. So you went back to school, and was that to finish an ed degree, performance degree, after being on the road? Or?
Well, I'm glad you asked. I was going to finish my ed degree, and I realized I didn't want to be in a public school classroom. And John Mount was pretty upset with me. In fact, most of the faculty was one guy had my back. Larry Gukin, the director of bands. He goes, hey, he says, you know, I know the success you've had going out on tour. He says, you could always come back and get the ed sequence. He says, you're almost done. Because I only needed student teaching, and then I had my degree. I couldn't see myself do. So I changed to theory composition, which ended up taking me extra years because I got those tours in between. I couldn't take, because they were only offered once a year, so I had to wait to take those classes. So it took me a few extra years to get through college. What would normally be like 5-6 year degree. I was there for 9 years, but of course I was touring. So I'd go out on a tour, come back, wait. Oh, I can take a class. And then I get a call for another tour, go out. So I finally got the degree, yeah. But I've not regretted it. And I kudos to all those guys that I know who've done it and are still doing it. You know, my friend Chris Bure, who eventually came back, ran the program at Central, took over for John after a couple other folks. He just retired. But like, you know, guys like Jim Sisko and Jake Bergevin and, gosh, just countless guys.
Well, I know with all the, I mean, if you're a musician and you're on social media, you know about all the stuff that's gone on with the college in Bellevue and Jim's program, and which is not the educator's fault per se, but more administration. And it's been really not only with that program, but several other programs. You see how you have these great great minds running these programs, and then they build up these great things, and then the administration, which, you know, they'll say, oh, we're here for the students, blah, blah, blah. And then they just destroy the program from inside, which is very difficult to see.
Well, that happened to Mount Hood. You know, one of the premier programs, even for, you might say it's community college, but anywhere. They had this great program where they turned out some amazing musicians, amazing talent. Some of those guys ended up at Central, of course. And then the jazz festival that was a result of that, an international jazz festival that's part of that program. How are you going to, guess what? You can teach so much about how to run a jazz festival and the business aspects of that. How could you not see that as an administration? It befuddles me.
I mean, there's many. We won't discuss. That's a whole other interview for another time about schools and colleges and the administration and what they're really there to do versus what they actually, whatever.
Right.
Anyways, all right. Well, we're at that time we need to wrap up. There's a million other things that I'd love to discuss, and we're sadly out of time.
Well, should I mention something about career-wise?
Please. Yeah.
Just so you guys know, I was talking to the career. I did music full-time for 25 years. And about 15 years ago, because of finances, and I have a family, 4 kids, I had to make a decision. So I stepped away, started getting jobs in the corporate world. Believe it or not, it was the best decision for my music career. I've done more playing with better players for more money, more recording, more touring than I did when I was a full-time musician. And I can now pick and choose the gigs I want to do because I have a stable income and I don't have to worry about hustling the next gig, hustling the next student. One time I had 24 students a week. And let me tell you, it was so exhausting, I didn't want to play. Now I can just play on my own time, and it's actually given me a chance to improve on my drumming, and improve on my piano playing. And, now I think I told you, I've always done the left hand, well, to actually go in full B3 mode in the last couple of years as well. So, and I'm thinking about pulling out the saxophone again here pretty soon. I've got the flute going a little bit.
And you can call Jay Thomas, and you can go down the rabbit hole of reeds and mouthpieces, the unending. All right, well, this is a good segue into my next question for you. So here you are in 2022. You've done all these tours. You've played with all these great musicians and had all these wonderful experiences. If someone was coming to you and was considering undertaking being a professional musician, given all the things that you've learned, what are some pieces of advice that you think have been very helpful for you to become the musician that you are today? What would you tell them?
First thing is know what it is you want to do in terms of your music and what you want to play. And first do that. Second of all, come up with a plan to get there. Third of all, you've got to practice. There's no shortcuts. No shortcuts. Let me repeat that. No shortcuts. You got to put the time in. And even more than that, you got to do the listening. And when I say do the listening, you can't just kind of skate with it. You got to get into the detail of it. What makes – there's that series that, what's his name, guitar player, all over YouTube. What's his name? He has that series, What Makes This Song Great? And he does it with pop tunes. I can't think of his name right now. But he breaks down the tune. It's like, listen to this bass line with it. You have to do that like if you're a jazz player. John Clayton has this thing. You listen to a recording 10 times. Go back and listen to just your instrument 10 times. Go back, and I'm talking the whole album. Go back, listen to the drums 10 times. Go back, listen to the bass 10 times. Listen to what, and then go back and listen to everything. Guess what? Your hearing is going to change. Eventually, what I started doing was, after doing that, I would get an album. I'd keep it in my car for a week and listen to one album in the week in the car when I was commuting. And now I can put something on and I can hear stuff like, I go, this is going on, this is going on, and you can, because your awareness level,
We've done several of these, and no one, we've talked about listening, but the point you make here is very, very important for any musicians or students watching. The actual listening, there's active listening and there's passive listening, and a lot of times, we'll be doing homework and listening, and it's good, but it's not the same thing as active listening, like what you just said, breaking something down and listening to each individual part multiple times, so you're hearing all of that. We could talk about this forever. We have to stop. I'm sorry. We have to do a sound check. So, Reuel, thank you so much. There's a bunch of other stuff that I would love to get to. We're just out of time, so we'll have to do another one of these for sure. But thank you so much for being here today and sharing your sage advice and experience with us. And it's been a pleasure. So
sage advice. Huh?
Yeah.
Does that mean I'm old?
There's a lot of gray here, too. So, anyways, so glad to have you here today. We're going to take a short break, do a quick sound check here, and then start the live stream with a bunch of original music for you starting at 5 p.m. If you've been enjoying the weekly series here and find value in the work that we're doing with the interviews and the concerts and the new compositions, and as I should also say, the majority of our content throughout the year is 100% free in all ages to participate in. So if you enjoy that and you want to contribute to the work we're doing, you can make a donation via Venmo or PayPal. That information is at the beginning of this post. You can also mail a check. So we'll be back here next week. I can't remember what's going on next week, but yeah, for our series. So thank you for joining us today. Hope you've enjoyed the content, and we'll see you again soon.